Voilà, mais j'ai le grand plaisir de laisser maintenant la parole à Tristan Auro, qui est le directeur du Centre d'analyse et de prévision stratégique du ministère des Affaires étrangères, pour ce deuxième panel intitulé « Intéresser les citoyens à l'action diplomatique ». Merci beaucoup Tristan d'avoir accepté de modérer cette table ronde. Vous avez la parole.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Professeur. Très heureux de pouvoir vous retrouver ce matin pour ce panel, pour cette discussion qui intervient après des échanges déjà très riches dans la matinée lors de l'intervention du ministre et du premier panel, et donc que l'on va s'efforcer de continuer et d'approfondir dans ce second panel. Where, if I may, I will switch to English for the different panelists, and so as to make it as lively as possible with my colleagues around me. So let me first thank Sciences Po and the CERI and the Académie diplomatique et consulaire for the opportunity to address those very important topics. And starting with the title of this panel, Intéresser les citoyens à l'activité diplomatique, I think that one starting point could be the fact that, as was mentioned this morning, actually the level of interest in diplomatic activity and in international relations is actually extremely high in the society. And actually, when we look at the different topics that have been mentioned this morning, be it the new US administration, be it the war in Ukraine, the question of defense and security in Europe, the situation in the Middle East, I could go on and on mentioning global issues like climate. On all those issues, if we look at social networks, if we look at the TV, newspapers, it's all over the place, and the interest in the public is extremely, extremely important, which raises the challenge to that we will further explore in this discussion, namely how best to answer to this growing expectation within society in all its diversity towards international matters. So here I would like to explore together with panelists around me 3 sets of questions which I think are at the heart of everything we've been discussing since this morning. The first is linked up to democracy, and it's been said by the minister. The fact is that what's behind all the discussions we've been having this morning is about accountability. It's all about explaining the major choices that are being made by public authorities on the issues I just mentioned, which are having direct impact on our daily lives. And I won't delve into this, but this is obviously the case. This raises a series of questions on, it's been said in the previous panel, to what extent you can open basically the fabric of diplomacy given the secret nature of some of the negotiations. That's one dilemma when it comes to this democratic dimension of the discussion. The question of representation that's been mentioned in the first panel, and how to actually go about this in a democracy where, let's face it, there is a growing polarization on several of the issues I just mentioned, where the debates can be pretty vivid, and where the basis for a consensus around foreign policy is being put into question. So just mentioning those elements, but which I think form the background in which we approach those issues. The second set of questions to me relates to the different stakeholders we're talking about. As it has been very rightly pointed out in the first panel, when we talk about the people or the citizens, who are we talking about? Actually, on the Kakemono, just it's about engaging stakeholders. who are we talking about? And here I think it's important to have a diverse view of the stakeholders in question. Of course, it all starts with citizens and parliaments, but I think that now when we're thinking about foreign policy, there are many other actors that have been mentioned since the beginning of this grand séminaire. Just to name a few, we mentioned local governments, we mentioned the private sector. I would add think tanks, research centers, NGOs. I mean, there's a complex ecosystem that is contributing and interacting with diplomatic activity on a daily basis. And here I must say that as the director of the CAPS, so the Center for Analysis, Planning and Strategy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it is actually our daily job to interact with all those actors. But I think that we need to have this broad view of the diverse types of stakeholders we're talking about. And the third point that I think is worth exploring is actually the means, methods, concrete tools that are available to diplomats, but not only, also to those different actors to actually interact with diplomats and professionals of diplomacy. And I think it's important to also get into this concrete methods that are being used, not only in France. Some has been said by the minister on what's happening here, but as has been said, we're far from where we could be, and that requires a lot of creativity in thinking about new methods, new ways of interacting. Again, it's been said already, and here I think it's extremely important to get inspiration from examples, from methods that are being used by ministries in other countries. And it's been said by Didier that actually the diplomat is about putting yourself in the shoes of others and actually looking at how other diplomatic services are interacting precisely with citizens, and the different actors I mentioned is certainly a worthwhile exercise. So these are, just to set the scene for our discussion, a series of questions which we will explore together with my panelists around me, which I'm very pleased to introduce. So starting from the right, Stéphanie Balme, who's director at the CERI at Sciences Po. HwaJung, who's professor at the Ewha Women's University in Seoul. Hannah Pfeiffer, who's professor at the University of Hamburg, and Jan Millison, who's director of research at the University of Leiden. All of them have been working in different manners on those issues, and I think here to start with, I would like to give the floor to Anna, who's been exploring those questions, in particular in Germany, and in how the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Germany has been practicing this interaction. So with no further ado, I pass you the floor, Anna.
Thank you so much, Tristan, and thank you so much for having me here in this great event. So we already heard that the name of the panel is Intéresser les citoyens à l'activité diplomatique. With Anna Geis, I am co-PI in a Hamburg-based research project on citizen participation in foreign and security policy, and I would therefore say the reversed perspective is almost as important. When and why are diplomats interested in citizens' activity? And I think, Ewha, you said something similar in your intervention earlier. So in my short statement, I will show how these two perspectives are actually interconnected. The citizens' interest in diplomatic activity and the diplomats' interest in citizens' activity. And I will tell you a bit, Tristan, you already said it, from the German context, which is the core of our, the core case of our research project. But from still limited research on, into the French context, I know that some of the problem descriptions are shared beyond Germany, and some of it we've already heard earlier today by the foreign minister. And so luckily this grand séminaire turned out to be a data gathering opportunity for me as well. So while foreign and security policy used to be considered a remote field for citizens' everyday life, this has changed a lot. So yes, I would say there is an increased need for diplomats' accountability in their relation to citizens. In Germany, the presence of the international has become very tangible over the last years, and thus foreign policy making and the successes and failures of diplomacy have come closer to the everyday life of people as well. We've heard several examples already today where that is the case, be it the arrival, and now I'm switching to the German context, of refugees from the Syrian war zone in 2015, the explosion of energy prices after the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, or the terrorist and guerrilla attacks on soldiers and civilians in Israel by Hamas and other militant groups in fall 2023, and the subsequent war and genocide in Palestine. These events have shaken German society to the core. In a sense, then, citizens do not have to be interested in diplomatic activity at all. We've heard that. They are interested in precisely this, even though they may not always be aware of this interest. In fact, one of the core problems seems to be that the interest in diplomatic activities and the problems of foreign policy making have been captured by far-right actors and discourses, and thereby, in a way, nationalized or domesticized. Let me show you this reframing and how it worked by using the same three examples that I just alluded to. So in this way, the problem of the Syrian civil war became, in Germany, one of Überfremdung, a German term to describe the sentiment of over-estrangement vis-à-vis too many foreigners. From this grew, by now pervasive Islamophobia, based on the idea of a forced Islamization of Europe. The Russian war of aggression led to both a considerable far-right minority and a very small self-proclaimed left minority claiming the presence of a war-lingering majority in Germany that was willing to risk German security and Germany's prosperity. For the far-right extremist Alternative for Germany, AfD, the Russian war is primarily a question of the well-being of the German economy and, of course, the West's fault. And finally, the most brutal escalation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is debated from left to right, and in Germany without exception, as a question primarily of Staatsräson, centering Germany and Germans and the correct anti-Semitic stance we have to take in Germany. The capturing of foreign policy issues by the far right and their transformation into questions of national identity beyond the far right entail several problems. The first is that problems of international politics and their particularity are no longer taken seriously in the political debate, and we've heard about this problem this morning as well. They are coded as a problem of national versus foreigner. This means, second, that it is by now very hard to interest citizens for the problems that diplomats have to deal with as diplomatic actors or as foreign policy problems that follow their own logic and not these nationalist discursive logics alone. At the same time, however, third, issues of foreign policy have become politicized, and we've heard that as well. We cannot talk about the people anymore. They have become politicized, which means that citizens cannot simply be ignored away from these problems. If foreign policy decisions and practice could take place behind closed doors in the past, more or less, they are now a matter of public contention. So in combination, this means that foreign policymakers and diplomats can no longer rely on a tacit consensus when dealing with their affairs. And that's a problem that we've heard this morning as well. So in Germany, this assessment has already been made quite a while ago. I can go into details about what's been happening in Germany in terms of formats. It's been going on for more than 10 years now. And it is among the reasons why we have been observing very careful openings of the Federal Foreign Office to the citizenry, and then ever more daring formats of participation and deliberation, or domestic diplomacy, if you will. This is one means by which German foreign policy has tried to make diplomats more accountable. We know that one strong motivation for this opening is precisely the feeling of having to explain foreign policy matters, and I've heard that this morning as well from the minister, to citizens in order not to lose them over to these topics to the far right. The most impressive format of citizen engagement that we saw in Germany was a whole series of participation events in the formulation of Germany's first national security strategy in 2022. So at the beginning of the process in March, Foreign Minister Baerbock promised a process that would be broad and participatory. The Federal Foreign Office designed a three-part series of events consisting of 7 citizen dialogues, 2 open situation rooms, and a final event. It said that public perceptions, opinions, and questions regarding security policy challenges were to be gathered through direct contact with citizens on site. In dialogue with one another and together with the participating experts, the participants were to develop concrete target formulations for the German national security strategy. The foreign minister herself took part in around half of these events with randomly selected citizens, and various diplomats were involved as experts. So were some militaries. I can tell you more about this remarkable participation effort later. We observed most of the events, and from this participatory observation, several points stand out. So first, citizens are interested and actually show a very good grasp of foreign policy matters and the situations in which diplomats find themselves, which you can see in these forms of engagement. They are very well able to argue rationally and come up with reasonable suggestions, even though we observe that they tend to prefer the discussion of topics that are close to their everyday experience, which is not surprising. Second, the diplomats present were as surprised as they were impressed with the quality of the citizens' debates. They had hardly ever encountered their own citizens and clearly underestimated them. Third, given the quite considerable effort made to organize this series of participatory events, hardly any impact in terms of concrete influence on policy can be observed. That's not the only impact that such events have, but this is one that we observed very little. And this is actually matched by a very low interest by classical media in the fact that citizens were addressed in this way, which I found surprising. So the media were very interested in what Annalena Baerbock had to say at these events, but they weren't interested that it was actually the citizens who were present. So what I've said so far shows that it is maybe not so much about interesting citizens in diplomacy, but rather about interesting diplomats and the broader public in the role of citizens in foreign policy, or at least in being a well-equipped citizen in the 21st century, with world politics having entered the everyday of our societies. And diplomats and foreign policy makers have to insist that they bring problems to the table that cannot simply be solved within the logics of domestic politics. And I think the core audience for this message or insistence are the parties beyond the far right, who can only lose by getting drawn into the toxic discourse that only knows the own nations and its problems.
Thank you so much, Anna. It's been... Thank you so much. It's a fascinating example, and I wish we have time afterwards to go for questions and answer on this specific. And I must say that on the national security strategy, it has even more echo at the moment, as we are currently updating our national security strategy. And the example you mentioned is a great source of inspiration, and I wish we have time to come back to this. And now I turn to you, Professor HwaJung Kim, because after this German perspective on those questions, having insights into the example of South Korea is also proving to be extremely useful source of inspiration for us. So extremely interested in how you can tell us about the way these discussions is approached in Seoul and how it translates into interactions with the citizens.
Thank you so much. First of all, I really want to express my gratitude for this wonderful seminar, and then also merci beaucoup for everyone make it happen so great. And then I'm so honored to introduce South Korea's citizen engagement in diplomacy, because to explain what happened in South Korea, I must explain a little bit of the background of the public diplomacy, because South Korea already have the cultural diplomacy back then in the 1990s, and also since then South Korea has another presidential committee on national branding initiative. It's all those two, cultural diplomacy and then nation branding, is led by the president. So it's a so South Korea, because very much a centralized mode of governance, and then also very hierarchical. So we cannot really say it's if it's led by the ministry, whether it is really effective, but that back then in 1990s and early 2000, led by the president, it makes a lot of sense. So that's the kind of foundation of South Korea's citizen engagement in diplomacy. And then 2013, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has a great moment that they need to, great transition from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, because back then in 2000, FTA is everywhere, like top agenda of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And then now the trade pillar is going to the Ministry of Industry. So Ministry of Foreign Affairs, MOFA, needs some new pillar that is going to be the public diplomacy. So the ministry try to reach out domestic public, so that what we are doing, because it's kind of the justification process of implementation of the public diplomacy. So they reach out to the domestic public first, and then the very first project done by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was it's called "You Can Do, I Can Do" PD. So which means that in Korean, like "no do, na do." Like do here in English is so no do, you do, I do, PD. So because why it is so important? Because South Korea, as you may well know, South Korea is technically at war situation. So most of the diplomatic practices, like very high security issues, and then just of course it's very closely related to our daily life. Of course, the security issue, that's very important. But at the same time, this the general public kind of thinking diplomatic affairs done by the super elites, super smart people, or done by the summit or the head of state or ministers or ambassadors, not ours. So there is a huge barrier like diplomacy, and also there is a kind of negative connotation. Like if diplomacy is, it's not that really good. So, but when it comes to diplomacy, but at the same time there is another feeling that these are the people, like diplomats are super elite, so probably that must be something else that the general public cannot discuss. So that's the general sentiment in South Korea. But once the Ministry of Foreign Affairs done this campaign, like you do, I do public diplomacy, and it's kind of very attractive to the general public. And then they're thinking, oh wow, why not? We can do some diplomatic, like super smart behavior vis-a-vis some countries. So that's really nice. So the design itself, like the general public can like this is a kind of grant program. So they can fill out some application. Then this is our plan to do. For example, I really want to do taekwondo diplomacy in Mongolia. So they can be non-profit organization or individual citizen. So they can apply for this program, and then the Ministry of Affairs, they choose some, the very nice the candidates, and then they can actually do these diplomatic behaviors off-road. So, which is really, unprecedented. Like that was not happening in the past. Like they got funded by the government and they do something. Like as a citizen, they are teaching taekwondo in Mongolia. Oh my gosh, it's really wonderful. So that's the you do, I do PD. So since then, there is a really like diplomacy became a favorable term among the general public, but still there is an ongoing tension in between. Of course, North Korea's nuclear provocation almost every time, and then South Korea squeeze all these four strong powers, the United States and then China, of course Russia and Japan. So South Korea is a helpless shrimp. It's our old saying, like helpless shrimp, while the big whales fighting each other. So, but still, South Korea really want to implement public diplomacy based on this campaign, you do, I do, PD. So South Korea needs some legal foundation, because without the legal foundation, they cannot really do the proper behavior. Again, it's vis-a-vis the domestic audiences. So they enacted the law, public diplomacy, in 2016. And then the law actually clearly underlines the involvement of people. So that's the state responsibility. to you must engage people as actor. So now here is also a huge change. Like always people say we are the probably very objective of other countries' diplomatic behavior. But here, because of this law, they are thinking, oh, we could be a subject of the diplomacy. You could be a legitimate actor of the diplomacy. So that's a really fantastic sort of the paradigm shift among this general public. And since then, 2016, let me read out this PD law, by the way. The state responsibility is to engage the domestic public. States must form social consensus on the importance of PD, public diplomacy, and promote the people's participation in public diplomacy. So since then, they developed many programs, just like very similar to you do, I do PD. So many programs. So I calculate the whole number of the programs, it's more than 500, because they have a really wonderful collaboration with other ministries. Like now it's more than 12 ministries and also involving 17, the whole local governments. So those local governments also include their activities as PD programs so that they can expand these PD programs. So that's 2016 legal foundation. And then, unfortunately, we had our very first female president impeached. So that was a very significant moment. Our democracy at risk, of course, yes, and there are many political scandals surrounding her, of course, yes. One of the very skepticism, from the people, was unequal negotiation in between Japan and South Korea. So always South Korea have some feeling that's internalized anger toward Japan. So, but that was the issue of the comfort woman, like sexist labor, and then this female president did just quick decision without asking people's opinion. So now we can see people get empowered. I cannot really say because of you do I do PD campaign, but we know this now. People empowered and then they get smarter than before. So this is not the stupid mass, general public. They are much smarter than before. And then also they are having very keen interest in every single of the diplomatic affairs. So they are saying, we need to do the negotiation with Japan again. So that was kind of sentiment from the people. And then the next president, we normally call candlelight president. And then he also did this people-centered diplomacy. And that was the moment we have the first PD basic plan. And then there are many projects, so-called Eurasian Youth Academy, KF, Global Challenger, PD Academy, Youth International Challengers, and so forth. So these are the things reach out to the domestic audiences. And then we have a very important institutionalization of citizen involvement in diplomacy, which is a participatory diplomacy center. That establishment is very important because they try to engage those general public in the process of foreign policy decision-making process. So the first one is a foreign policy suggestion. That's an annual contest, and then there are some results. And second one is people engagement program that definitely try to realize this deliberate democracy discussion. So that's how we call citizen consultation mechanism. So that is the realization of people engagement program in South Korea.
Thank you very much for these insights, which I think show in a very clear manner that not only is there an expectation and a strong demand by society to get involved into those issues, but this is proving to be all the more relevant on the most complex issues and the most sensitive, which I think is extremely interesting in what you're describing, that it's not only on what we might describe as soft issues, but also on very sensitive ones. And I think that is something to keep in mind for the Q&A session. But I think it's extremely interesting as an insight. And now I will turn to Professor Melissen, who's coming from the University of Leiden and who has extensive experience both in academia and in think tanks, and who could provide us with his perspective on those issues in general, and also building on examples in The Hague, be it with the ministry or the parliament. But,
thank you very
please,
much,
over to you.
Tristan. And first of all, I would like to thank, ladies and gentlemen, Sciences Po for hosting us here in this wonderful lecture theater and in this place that never seems to change aesthetically. Like Saint-Germain, it's like frozen in time, which is a real compliment, I should say. In particular, Professor Christian Lequen, who has done important work in creating more awareness in France of the importance of engaging with the diaspora based on a multi-year research project. Also thanks to the Diplomatic Academy, I've already had the privilege of meeting the people from the Academy in The Hague when the discussions were at a very early stage. And I must say that you often hear many things in the wings of a conference rather than on the stage, that I'm really impressed by the ambitions of the Academy. Also in terms of not just doing the work of a traditional academy, but also developing, like sort of twin brother or twin sister of the strategy department, a knowledge capacity within the Academy and reaching out to society as a whole, the topic of this panel and conference. And it's also an honor to have my two colleagues here who know so much more than I do. And I really, their predicament to say in just a couple of minutes what they know about this must have been a torture, because they have been working for participating in citizens' dialogues, listening to how it works, having studied intensively with South Korea. And I think one message is perhaps that countries and foreign ministries and diplomatic academies should not try and reinvent the wheel, but really go and get their heads together and learn from one another. And I'm totally sure that there is a lot that we can learn from the German experience. And Koreans are always good at kicking in numbers, and the numbers in the Korean example showed us that is indeed a major thing, and also something that you don't do as a roadshow in episodic sense, but a sustained engagement with your citizenry. So when you ask practitioners, theorists and students of international relations about, so is there any deeper significance in this dialogue with citizens, they would probably say no. Having studied at Sciences Po or in any institution in Britain, France, the United States, Germany, or anywhere else in Europe, would say, well, no, there is not much significance to this. And I think the point that we're trying to make today is that indeed that dialogue with society is part of the fabrique de la diplomatie. And that is something we need to understand in practice, but we also need to understand conceptually. And if I may be so cheeky, it's not the strength of foreign ministries to think conceptually about what they do. And so the ambition to get this right conceptually is something also I really applaud. So perhaps it's then also an argument for studying as a student of diplomacy, studying things that are peripheral in diplomacy, that seem so marginal, perhaps irrelevant, but that tell us a lot about trends in the profession, changing practices. And I have two examples from my own modest work. One, when I started working on public diplomacy, I remember that my mentor in the UK wrote a dictionary of diplomacy where he defined it as propaganda for late 20th century diplomats. So then I knocked on the door of the foreign ministry and I thought, they are going to tell me what this is all about. The first question they asked me, Jan, what is public diplomacy? Please tell us. This was the head of the communication department. So looking at consular, at peripheral practices, another example would be consular diplomacy. When I started working on consular diplomacy, I never forget an interview at the National Audit Office, which in London, which started with the statement, consular as opposed to diplomacy. Now my international students know how this is really totally woven into all the activity of diplomacy, and it's related to development cooperation, to human rights, to the security agenda, to the human security agenda, etc., etc. So I don't stop getting bored about studying things that are absolutely peripheral in diplomacy, because I think they tell us something about wider trends. Then I think the time is right for students, and I would like to argue three things, but I'm sure I don't have enough time, so I may run into the discussion. First thing I would like to argue that the time is right for students to give more students of diplomacy to give more attention to domestic society, because diplomacy is not just about the relations of states, relations between states, but also the relations within collectives. So domestic diplomacy is not an oxymoron. What's interesting is that we don't read much about that in the study of diplomacy, but interestingly, the ministries tell us, practice tells us where theory should also go, that we have to get our head around this conceptually. So it's about not just diplomacy, not just about the relations between states or collectives, also within them. And that, I think, is a fundamental point. My late PhD student, who very sadly passed away before defending her PhD thesis, talked in 2011 about diplomacy with a domestic consciousness. I think she got it completely right, and she was, I'm talking about 2011, well ahead of her time with that observation. So then, Eva Neumann was talking about definitions of diplomacy, and that is indeed an interesting sort of trajectory, how you can see that different definitions of diplomacy show they become more and more inclusive. It's not just about a single function, negotiation, not just about a single actor, the state, or a single purpose, peace. Definitions of diplomacy become more and more inclusive. And I think also foreign ministries, governments should be open to alternative ideas about what diplomacy is, and also perhaps new interpretations of foreign policy. And when I look at the list of the dialogues that the minister was proposing this morning about trade, health, climate, immigration, war, when you can put a definition next to that, a classical definition of what foreign policy is. But perhaps the popular position today is more how all of these issues are a threat to domestic security, to individual safety, to national welfare, etc., etc. So rather than a very proactive, strategy-oriented foreign policy, often the perception of foreign policy is how things international and all the global crises thrown at us, how citizens within the domestic realm feel threatened by this, and that is perhaps something that needs to be challenged. So alternative views of diplomacy that open up the idea of diplomacy, and even being open to listening to how citizens experience the idea of foreign policy, which is not a traditional textbook decision, and I think we see that also parliaments are very much responding to that. Thirdly, I think there is an interesting academic knowledge agenda here on how to compensate for the domestic deficit in international relations studies and the study of diplomacy. When you do a study of international relations theory and you're interested in the state-society dynamic and what that means for international relations and diplomacy, you just hit nothing. I've done the exercise. You just hit nothing. You see, there is a total absence of this, of the study of state-society relations in IR, and largely also, arguably, in the study of diplomacy. Now, that is Also here, I think the knowledge agenda is also one for the academy. Comment engager la diplomatie sur la scène nationale is an ambitious agenda, and it's one perhaps also on how knowledge cannot be just given to society, which is important, sharing, understanding of the complexity of diplomacy and international relations, but also harvesting knowledge from society, mobilizing knowledge from society. And that's perhaps where it is interesting to refer to the beginning of the 18th century, when the French Académie Politique was also at the beginning of a whole new world of the professionalization and institutionalization of diplomacy, and the question of how to understand that. And where also French thinkers were making a contribution to how we understand diplomacy, and that so institutional initiative of the equivalent of the Académie Politique perhaps has its interesting contemporary equivalent than in the work of the Academy. So these two other speakers are, and you'll have to stop me, these two other speakers are co-authors in a book that we have edited, which has a pretty appropriate title, Home Engagement in Diplomacy. Subtitle, Global Affairs and Domestic Publics. So it's sort of spot on what we are discussing here. So we invited a critical person to write the conclusions, a senior Canadian academic. And one of the points in his conclusion was, this book raises more questions than it answers. I can share honestly with you, it has given me one bad evening. But subsequently, I came to realize that actually this is a compliment. And in light of the lack of a tradition of studying the state-society dynamic, it is totally understandable that there is still so much to figure out. So I hope that the modest role of this book can be that we have kicked off a discussion that is an important one. That's an important one also because the absence of the study of state-society relations, this dynamic in diplomacy, has sustained an elite dominated view of diplomacy and has sustained an idea of diplomacy where citizens are represented by institutions, parliament, we can discuss that later, but the problem is perhaps that we are facing a lack of trust in government, a crisis of representativeness, where many people don't feel represented by the institutions in society that are supposed to represent them. So the game then, I think, is to work with a sort of multi-layered approach, working through civil society organizations, representative institutions in society, and getting the dialogue right with people who are the fickle publics, even the subaltern counter publics, the people who don't feel represented, the people who have alternative ideas about foreign policy. So home engagement in diplomacy is then looking also at the smallest unit of society. Now, what are the drivers? And do I have 2 or 3 minutes?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. What are the drivers of home engagement or participatory diplomacy? And here I'm just mentioning a few. And because again, it may be very tempting to say that the government and the foreign ministry is in the driving seat. They are taking the initiative. They're taking the initiative for good reasons. There may be a lack of trust in government. The Dutch foreign ministry is now, after huge budget cuts in 2008-9, is now facing budget cuts of 22% on the departmental budget. As you can imagine, the leadership of the ministry is really waking up to where does this come from? Where does this come from? Electorates matter, electorates vote. And the votes have massive consequences, as we've seen with Brexit and as we've seen with the election of the second Trump administration. So where the executive branch then has good reasons to dialogue with society, and of course, also very positive reasons, because one needs what the Dutch call red teams. One needs counter-thinking. One needs critical ideas by people who are not in the orbit of government, which is what many organizations are in society, and even the traditional think tanks. But also parliaments can take the initiative, because legislators, they see diplomacy then as an activity that's in the first place serving society, and as such accountable to elected politicians. And this is where also in this informal talk with Tristan, we discussed yesterday how there are national differences and how there is this much more proactive role in the Netherlands of Parliament, and I can say more about that in the discussion than is the case in France. And then, of course, the initiative may come also from society itself rather than from government. But the environment is becoming more complicated because of the erosion of trust, because of the rise of populism. And in the case of populist governments may feel that they actually have a mandate, that they, for some kind of by some kind of divine inspiration, they know what the people think even without talking to them and dialoguing with them, because they've received the electoral mandate. So my point would be, perhaps, and as an academic project, that we also need a more integrated perspective on what this state-society dynamic means for diplomacy, including groups that are not well organized, and so that we go in the direction of a whole of society diplomacy rather than a whole of government diplomacy. Understanding diplomacy with a domestic consciousness, or, which is not translatable into French, a societized diplomacy is a joint project for academia and government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for providing more conceptual clarity to this discussion, which is indeed something we're also striving to do with the Academy, and it's extremely useful to get this insights from you, and reminding that those dynamics we're talking about are a two-way street, and it's not only about explaining, it's about harvesting, and it's about having this interaction that goes and should go both ways when we think about it. And thank you also for mentioning the book that you coordinated on home engagement in diplomacy, which I think would be mandatory reading for anyone willing to continue and deepen this conversation. But with no further ado, I will pass the floor to Stéphanie Balme. I'll give you the mic as well.
Are you comfortable? Okay, so there's another solution. Another one.
Here you go.
Good Lord.
Là, c'est bon.
Ça va?
Ouais.
Working.
Is it comfortable for you, Kim? Okay. Tu m'en rapproches. Okay. This is French hard power. So as an introductory, so my name is Stéphanie Balme. I'm the director of the Center for International Studies at Sciences Po. And so it's CERI, C-E-R-I, for all of you who might not be yet on our mailing list. You can Google CERI and then click on the top right part of the website, and you'll be able to access to all the events that we're organizing. And we're organizing as it's open source, open science, and it's very much with the idea of engaging with civil society. I would like to say merci to Christian Lequen, definitely. Thank you so much for organizing this huge, amazing conference. Thank you so much to l'Académie as well. I would like to have words of welcome to our guests and a wink to my students that I can see in the amphitheater today. There is a term paper and a deadline. Please don't forget about the deadline. But I would like to say that those of the students who attend the conference are organizing next week an amazing graduate seminar. Chrysler, I can see you here. It's a graduate seminar on U.S. science diplomacy and the dismantlement of U.S. aid. Just to say that we need to engage with the civil society, but also with the young generation. So that was also a way to help the students to have a crowd for next week. I think I have like 9 minutes, 8 minutes. If I don't take all my time, it will be fine for the Q&A. But I'm going to present you a counter example to what we are talking about today. Because I've devoted a lot of my time on the issue, the topic of science diplomacy. Today my class is called Science and Tech Diplomacy. And actually science diplomacy, which has been, as you know, probably historically an extremely old tradition. You know, it's a new concept, but it's a very old practice. But the new concept has been created bottom up by scientists and imposed to diplomats who didn't really care about it. So I think it's a counter-example in a way that we struggle to find the right level within the diplomatic networks, to find the right frameworks to make science diplomacy at the heart of the political agenda of diplomacy. And so just to tell you this, in 2009, academics like us met in London at the Royal Academy of London with AAAS, the American Advancements for Science Association in Washington, and they gathered together and say, we are growingly, acting as diplomats. We are doing scientific cooperation in a world where decoupling, de-risking, the terms did not exist yet, but it was exactly the idea. And we are doing, we're becoming diplomats. We are doing science we are doing science for diplomacy, and sometimes we're asking diplomacy for science. But more importantly, we don't see where science is used for, during international negotiations and for basically delivering the best diplomacy we need. And we're facing issues like space diplomacy, climate diplomacy, health diplomacy, for sure science, tech, and innovation diplomacy. And where do we, at the international, multilateral level, regional level, national level, really do take into account science for international relations and negotiations? So let's get together. And so after this conference, they produced a very important paper which institutionalized the notion of science diplomacy. And here we are in 2025, 50 years later. And 50 years later, they have republished a new document, taking the experience of these last 15 years of evolution of the concept of science diplomacy. And basically, they're showing different things. We try to show different things. First of all, science diplomacy is very differently institutionalized according to the countries, to the tradition. So it's becoming more and more accepted, traditionally speaking, within traditional MFA structures. But there are confusions between cultural diplomacy, science diplomacy. It's very difficult to institutionalize it per se. And more importantly, we have seen these last 15 years a growing number of actors which are much more powerful in implementing science diplomacy than traditional actors. And the actors we've seen are not only here, places like here, universities. For example, you might know the U7+, which is an organization of universities around the world, which basically put on their agenda issues which are geopolitical and diplomatic issues. When it comes to decide scientific sanctions, when it comes to decide about scientific cooperation, with what is happening in the US right now, you cannot do that on a one individual university basis. It has to be done with different universities. And then you put pressure on your MFAs as well. So universities become actors of democracy and all scientific-related organizations. But also a very different example, cities, for example. A city like Geneva, Barcelona, Miami, have been extremely active in implementing and pushing forward the agenda of science diplomacy. Geneva, it's #1 on the Global Innovation Index. So basically, they want to remain #1, and they made science diplomacy one of their key dimensions. As a city itself, le canton de Genève, the canton of Geneva, has invested a lot on science diplomacy. Miami, very much so on climate change, and I'm sure you know why. And in particular, it started during Trump 1.0. And I have to say the US science diplomacy, which has always been very specific, investing on diaspora, absolutely fragmented, but very powerful, has, this US science diplomacy has survived Trump 1.0 thanks to its NGOs, its universities, its cities, which basically deconstructed the policies at a federal level. And of course, now the question is, will they be able to remain the same? But I will also go further by telling you that mostly now what science diplomacy is about is tech diplomacy. And so tech diplomacy, yes, of course, since 2017, when Denmark started to appoint tech diplomats, we see here and there tech diplomats, about 20, to the best of my knowledge, is 21 right now, worldwide tech diplomats, who are appointed not in a country, and they're not responsible for, their jurisdiction is not a country, but they usually are appointed in tech hubs, mostly of them in Silicon Valley, and they focus precisely on tech. But these tech diplomats they struggle with all private sectors, and particularly the tech giants. So tech giants are key private, huge, basically diplomats, super active in designing the international order we live in. Okay, so, and I could go on and on, but unfortunately we lack of time. So I would simply say, I would simply say a few things. Science diplomacy, through science diplomacy and tech diplomacy, which it's a whole heuristic, journey that we went through. It helps us understand international relations in a much better way, but it's also largely what international relations are made of. Therefore, we need to change our training process. We really need to engage more diplomats to be interested in this issue. Not only be interested, but be competent. It requires a particular skill. You need to understand AI to be a tech diplomat. And I have to say, because this week in my class, I've invited, and I told you so, Tristan, I've invited a very interesting young lady from Germany, because Germany is a good example to look at currently. The Minister of Foreign Affairs in Germany has created a data innovation lab. So basically he's funded a private institution to gather data and to think in terms of how integrating AI to foreign policy. And this young lady has presented to the class this week what she was doing. And she told the students, you have an asset, you're young, you possess generational skills that a lot of seniors like us either struggle to have these skills or simply don't have them, but you have, you have a competence which is highly needed to transform, basically diplomacies, and you will, and so your generation will have to be a general diplomat, knowing basically your history, your geography, and I would say the history of international relations, but you also have to be very competent in what is going to shape international, starting from today, which is data, AI, and tech. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, for shedding light on those actors and this idea that beyond the interactions we've been discussing, the fact is that diplomacy is not limited to classical diplomatic actors, and that actually those actors you mentioned, and tech giants, I think, is a case in point, are actually playing a role in reshaping the international order. That's absolutely massive. So what I suggest now, and I'm just turning to Professor Lequen, because as we started slightly later, I'm wondering if we end up at 45, in which case we'll do, or if we take some more time, just 45.
No, we can go until 1 o'clock.
Wonderful. So we have a bonus. Thank you so much. I just wanted to know, but that's great. So we can have a half an hour question and answer session, which I think would be a great opportunity to come back to several points that have been made, because it's been a very rich set of presentations made by panelists. So please, I see a question on the left of Ewha, so the mic is coming. And please, grateful if you can briefly introduce yourself and tell if you're interested in raising a question to a specific panelist, please.
Thank you so much for your presentations. My name is Anne-Louise Chartier. I am a student here at Sciences Po in International Governance and Diplomacy. So my question is specifically towards Mr. Tristan Auro and Mr. Jan Melissen. But if anyone wants to also answer, feel free. So since we're talking about the public opinion and diplomacy, well, the word pandemic, maybe a decade ago, was not well known by many people. Today is more of a trauma because of COVID. And people know what a pandemic is and what is to live during a pandemic. And my question is related to also another word that people don't know but is starting to appear, was elected the word of the year in 2022 by Collins Dictionary, which is permacrisis. The idea that we live in a time that is not only about cycles of crisis, but complex crises that are interconnected and more complex, and a permanent state of crisis, different types at different times. So today I was wondering how diplomacy can answer to a period of permacrisis that we're living today, that can include future pandemics, maybe, I hope not, but and other types of crisis, into having an anticipatory strategy, but also building resilient relationships. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I suggest maybe we take 2-3 questions, and so we can answer then. Please. Sorry.
Friedrich Catois, I'm a former German diplomat who did half of its career before the fall of the wall and at the same time afterwards. And I'm retired for a long time, but I'm still in business. I wanted to ask Hannah Pfeiffer, you mentioned migration, and you mentioned it with 2015. Mm-hmm. The migration crisis started in 1975, and in 1976, the German judicial system collapsed completely because of more than 100,000 judicial reviews of all this immigration. I was on the spot. I was in Pakistan. I went to East Berlin. And just for fun, Mr. Vladimir Putin, he entered Secret Service in 1976. But from this point, do we need, as diplomats, talk only narratives, or do we need to talk about reality? And this migration followed me during the whole career, and the problem with United States followed me during my whole career, and the problems with Putin, KGB, also during the whole career. And that is the reality. And that was all around 1989 and so on. So I saw this morning in the France Inter, they were speaking about an IMO meeting where Trump again blocked. But I have seen the same letter which Trump said to IMO. I saw it signed by Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, and menacing, threatening German and other European powers if they would impose environmental standards on international traffic. So we have to compare. Mm-hmm. Of course, Trump is completely out of the world, but still his methods are not completely different from what I experienced 40 years ago, or 30 years ago, or 20 years ago. The American way of reciprocity is something completely out of the moon.
Okay.
Sorry to speak so long.
No, thank you. Maybe a last question, and so we can go to answers. Yeah, please.
Thank you. Thank you for an amazingly rich and really interesting to have those comparisons between different cases. Claire Hart, I'm from the Metropolitan, Vice President of the Metropolitan Council of Montpellier, a city in the south of France. And I'd like to address a question and a testimonial to Kim, if I might. I just want to say that as we're on the receiving end of your PD, you're incredibly successful. We are contacted continually by wonderful cities of South Korea who are seeking twinships, they're seeking cooperation processes, may it be sports or culture, but it's really, really sustained and continued, and it's done very well. And I have to say that after a while, we might not have set out with a project to work with South Korea, but at the end of the day, we always say yes, because you're so good at it. So I want to know how do you fund this? Is it the initiative of individual cities or individual people? Is it a master plan? Do you have like a strategy behind this? Because it really works, and the cultural diplomacy is amazing, you know, because you touch young people through hip-hop, through series, through films, you know, all of the youth culture is struck. And we have young diasporas in our city, be they students or others, who are just doing the job for you, and they're doing it very well. So tell us more about your master plan, please.
Thank you. Maybe I suggest, so we may start with this one and then pick the other questions, but absolutely, tell us about the master plan. Okay. And it's great to have feedback instantly from the rooms.
Yeah, because of the time constraint, actually, the South Korea seems like successful, but there are many constraints, and then there are many difficulties because of the government change, and then also South Korea have a very weak point of the 5-year single-term presidency. So every single president really wants to achieve an impossible mission. So that's how we understand like South Korean context. But for example, the master plan is the first one is like for the prosperity of for the people, and then there is a big theme from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then there's an action plan within the very important pillar of PD. So the first one is, for example, cultural diplomacy. Second one is policy advocacy. So how we set policy-oriented public diplomacy. And then the last one is knowledge diplomacy. So normally knowledge diplomacy is all about Korean language and then history and then something like that. And then our policy-oriented public diplomacy is more like being aligned with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs goals and aims. So they try to send out the message from the people's voice. So it's that's the one. And then the cultural diplomacy, definitely that's the very, very huge pillar. But there is a very difficult time for Ministry of Foreign Affairs, because in South Korea, the ministry is very, in domestic power politics, a very weak power, because they normally just go outside and then they are doing very important job related to diplomatic practices. But in the domestic power politics, we have a dinosaur ministry, which is called the Ministry of Culture. So they are doing also very similar thing under the name of International Cultural Relations Project. So they also very similar act right after this 2016 PD Act. So in 2017, we have so many overlaps. Mm-hmm. So sometimes they get criticized because of reduce the number of programs. See, I already said 500, more than 500 programs. And then done by the Ministry of Culture, it's like more than 10,000. So it's like there are many overlapping programs. So that's the difficult thing. But at the same time, there is a synergic effect. Like synergy, so many programs concurrently, almost everywhere. And then it has a somewhat with the concept of prefix K, so K brand. So, and then next president has another master plan, like because he is now at the another difficult situation of impeachment. So he is considers South Korea as GPS, global pivotal states. So that's the theme of the second master plan. Also, we had the same pillar, cultural diplomacy, policy PD diplomacy, and also the third one is knowledge diplomacy. And this government actually add one more pillar, that is digital diplomacy. So everything, because the one excellent students mentioned the digitalization. So South Korea, because of the COVID-19. So because of COVID-19, MOFA did a lot of digitalization. And now they are looking into digital transformation. So they are trying to use metaverse and XR and then everything related to AI or something like that. And recently they installed AI diplomacy division at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So this is a one master plan depending on each government. And then we are looking forward to new president this June. So anyways, probably we will have a new master plan. Yeah, right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And in terms of branding, I must say this K thing is brilliant, as well as the GPS you just mentioned. I didn't know.
But I just hate the K brand.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
All the time it's so nationalistic. But no?
And we don't see it like that. Yeah, absolutely.
Really?
No, but the fact that it's being branded as a cultural openness and sharing of, I don't know, I would not say it this way. No, that's interesting.
Okay.
Let's continue. And maybe I would turn to Jan on the first question, on which I'd be happy to. Sorry, passing the floor to Anna first on the question relating to migration. Sorry.
Yeah. So thank you also for all the contributions, which I would be happy so much to discuss more with all of you as well. And thank you for the interventions from the audience. So if I understood correctly, the question that was inside your comment was a bit like, do we actually see something new? Or aren't the topics that we are seeing and the practices that we are seeing, they have precedence? And I would be with you in saying, okay, let's not pretend that everything is unheard of and unseen that we are witnessing at the moment. But Yeah, but I think, so Jan, you have alluded to this. If we follow the practice, then we see that there seems to be a sense that there is something new. And so I would argue that we should look for continuities, but also look for what is actually new. And I think, for one thing, we've heard about the poly crisis. I mean, we could also, I'm not a big fan of the word, but we can talk about this later. But I think that what we are seeing are very existential crises that are overlapping. The climate catastrophe, war, interstate war coming back, and the threat of totalitarianism being a real threat again. And these problems, they also have another way of being mediatized. And we've heard a bit about this. We didn't really go into it, but of course the question of social media and what can a global public actually be aware of today is also very important for this question of diplomatic accountability. So crises may be similar, and we may have had them before, but to actually make them tangible in everyday life, I think the conditions of mediatization have changed. And also, and that's what you said, Jan, the awareness that politicians feel they need to do something. At least for the German case, I can say that in 2014, diplomats and top politicians had the sense that they could no longer work with this reluctant German public that wasn't ready for Germany to take a greater role in the world, basically. And so they started explaining world politics to them, hoping that they would, understand that Germany needs to have a different posture in world politics. And the citizen outreach effort is part of this as well. So it's a way of, trying to close the elite-mass gap. It's a way of trying to counter the exploitation of topics of international politics by the far right, which coincided with this moment. So people, and I think that's also a shared problem across different societies. The far right benefits so much from the effects of globalization and international politics, and they can reframe that and use that for their strategic purposes. And so one way of the Germans to counter that was actually to reach out to citizens and to try to, explain what's happening in world politics. Why is it happening this way? We can talk at another point whether they succeeded or not, but that was actually at least one contextual factor. And so this legitimation effort for foreign policy, among others, is something I think that maybe wasn't as necessary in the past, and that's what I would say is a different story today.
Thank you very much. Jan, maybe on this question of the perma-crisis.
Yes,
and
on generally how to deal with crisis. I'm going to give a short answer, but I would also invite you, our chair, with a lot of experience and as a director of strategy, to address this question, because you have been visiting think tanks in North America and Europe, you've been talking to your counterparts, and one of the main, that's the good thing about the question, one of the main things on your menu must be, how can we, in a world of constant crisis, adapt to that as strategy units? So I think really the competent answer comes from you, not from me. My 2 cents. One, the fascinating thing, of course, about crisis as a student of international relations and diplomacy is that we see so many things happening that we don't see in a world with less ripples. And one of the interesting features of the COVID crisis was also the vaccine diplomacy, the competitive vaccine diplomacy, where suddenly the normative Europe was doing a lot less well than some other countries who immediately generously offered vaccines to the global south. But that's just a side note and giving Tristan time to think. And I think generally on what we see is that new strategies, there is much more of an emphasis on forecasting, which is a bit of a paradox, because one, you need to forecast, but we're surprised by one crisis after another. So what are we forecasting for? Just referring to the latest news from America. Also that probably diplomacy has to invest more in a data-driven planning. One could see foreign ministries and governments as institutions with a huge amount of knowledge. But how to mobilize and to organize and to systematize that knowledge is a question that was actually only asked recently. So I think indeed the planning departments have quite a task on their hands. And with that, I'd like to turn over to you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Jan. Indeed, I mean, this question is certainly at the very heart of what we're doing in the Center for Analysis, Planning and Strategy, where, as was said, we are constantly interacting with external actors to the ministry, with which we are having the possibility to have new perspectives to the analysis that are being developed within the ministry, which is one element of divergence and contradiction, which is extremely fruitful in putting into question the assumptions on the basis of which we're working all the time. So that's one thing. And the second thing I would say is that in the very fluid international environment we're in at the moment, the way we proceed is to work on scenarios. So it might sound a pretty classical way of working, but this is basically what we're doing on a constant basis. So these are not necessarily the most likely scenarios, but basically we're providing the minister and the other public authorities, the presidency office and the others, on possible scenarios that may have an impact on French interests, building on international trends. That's what we're doing on a constant basis. And referring to your question, we are looking at working with people that are specialized in all fields of foreign policy so as to intertwine different angles. Here, what I mean is that if you look at any crisis at the moment, you have to take into account pure security aspect, so you would have to look into military dimension, but you will have to look into disinformation aspects as well. So the whole informational space is something we're taking ever more into account. We're looking at environmental aspects of it, and now we are hearing a lot in the public sphere about the critical mineral dimension of what's happening in Ukraine and in the current negotiations. So basically intertwining these different dimensions into the scenarios we're putting to our authorities is what we're doing on a constant basis. Of course, the challenge at the moment is to anticipate on the trends that are changing extremely fast, and just also to do some self-criticism, as was mentioned. I was in DC 10 days ago. We were at the end of last year trying to anticipate the trends that would come up with this administration. And certainly we underestimated the speed at which the changes would happen. So this is extremely challenging at the moment to predict, but that's actually not what we're doing. We're not predicting, because nobody can, but at least we're trying to anticipate as much as possible, building scenarios and listing the consequences that it has for our diplomacy. So just in a nutshell, but this scenario planning is a method that's been used by all policy planning staff in the US and with our European partners, but that's certainly a lot of what we do. On the data-driven approach, that's certainly something on which there's a big room for improvement, because it's about building the capacities to exploit all the data in the informational space, and through AI products now we can analyze a lot more data in the informational space to fuel our understanding of the trends that are taking place. But this requires more equipment within ministries, and thus that is certainly a big challenge. So I'm just looking at the clock, seeing that we have a little less 10 minutes ahead of us, so I don't want to be too long, and maybe if there are a few set of questions that we can answer quickly, please.
Hello, my name is Alexander Huang. I am Associate Professor of Communication at Gustav Eiffel University. I'm the Public Diplomacy Scholar, so thank you for this wonderful debate. But I have a question about the place and the role of communication skills for diplomats. Because I don't have a lot of diplomats friends, but I have. When I talk with them, they said, okay, this is our nature skills. We don't care about communication. But that's not true. Especially at this kind of digital age, we are talking about the public engagement. So for diplomatic training program, do we really care about the strategic communication skills for the diplomats? For example, when we learn a lot of public diplomacy cases from the pioneer country of Sweden. Sweden MFA did a lot of good Twitter. They got a lot of international retreats. But if we look at the engagement for their own citizen, it's not really good. That means even though Sweden has a really wonderful public diplomacy plan for international audiences, but the local people, citizens, do not care about what the MFA has done. That means maybe they didn't learn about the citizens' needs, or they didn't do the good listening process as well. So my question is, where is a place for the diplomats if we want sensibilize our citizens to join the diplomatic practice or public diplomacy actions? Maybe, King, you can give us more insightful ideas, because Karen did a really good job. Yeah, thank you.
Maybe we can take a very last question, and then, Kim, I'll give you the floor. Maybe if there's one last question from the audience.
If there is not, I have a question to another panelist.
Then please do. That's the right time to do it.
Okay. I would like to ask Stephanie about science diplomacy. And what's fascinating about this discussion is that actually the initiative, as you explained very well, comes from the scientists themselves. And only gradually we see that the field of international relations and scholars are catching up, that they are joining this debate. And I was wondering whether perhaps the original conceptualization of science diplomacy has been too idealistic, underrepresenting the competitive element of science diplomacy, where science diplomacy and technology offices of countries, even within Europe, are experiencing a playing field where they compete a lot with one another. Also from the point of view of the Global South, whether scientific attractiveness may actually be seen as science aggressiveness, in the sense that there is a big brain drain from people from the Global South going to the North, and those people don't return. So yeah, should we have, does it make sense to also look at the other side of science diplomacy?
Thank you very much, Jan. We have 4 minutes ahead of us, which is pretty short. But maybe, Stéphanie, if you'd like to start, here it is.
We have an issue with the mic. Okay. Thank you so much. So the 2 points, whether science diplomacy as a concept was too idealistic, I have to say yes, and for sure, and it was a good thing. First of all, because science in itself, just like diplomacy, that's why it's very compatible, aims for peace and development. Whenever a country considers that science is a tool for its power, it's called techno-nationalism. And surely the idea of science diplomats in 2009 was to say we live in a very competitive world. Not only diplomats need to know about science, but science needs to still be, for liberal democracies where we aim at, a tool for development. So it had to be idealistic at the beginning. It was slightly too idealistic in a way that we believed that we were about to change the world, and we didn't make it, and the world changed very much and much more than it changed. I mean, it changed us much more than we changed the world. And so now I think there is definitely a much more mature understanding of what science diplomacy is about. Still keeping in mind that techno-nationalism is against, works against the excellency of science and against the fundamental rights of people. By the way, a little bit of competition is always good, because it's always good also in science. So you have to balance between, including inner Europe. Inner Europe competition is very good for European science in itself, but you have to be aware of that level of competition and cooperation. Secondly, for the Global South, I look at it in a quite different way as you look at. Because why? I think among the countries which benefited the most of science diplomacy, specifically, precisely in the Global South, provided that we know how to define the Global South. I'm a China expert, so China loves to be part of the Global South. Scientifically speaking, it's the north of the north now. But provided you understand what the Global South is about, actually, when you look at the emerging regional scientific powers are all coming from the Global South. Egypt, Turkey, Rwanda, Thailand, Vietnam, regionally speaking, in terms of global innovation index. Most of them, so either they are emerging scientific ecosystems, and they use the term science diplomacy as a key foreign affairs strategy for the countries. And it's a tool for them to build up the scientific ecosystem. I can give you an example. Among the group of students I train at Sciences Po, a lot of them come from the Global South. They came back home, designed a policy of science diplomacy for the country. I'm thinking of a lady from Colombia in particular. And they need it. Secondly, in the Global South, as you know, they face climate change, development, US aid issues. They need science diplomacy. So the question is, do we need to interact more with Global South countries in terms of science diplomacy? The answer is absolutely yes. And my last point would be, you might have seen the European Science Diplomacy Strategy, which just came out in February. One of the key recommendations is precisely to do so.
Thank you very much. Wonderful.
And it's about 1, so you have 1 minute.
That's fine. All right, just 1 minute. Because South Korea's communication aspect of for the diplomats is normally risk management. So they try to do some new media channels and then all the things. But actually, public diplomacy is a two-way communication. But when it comes to new media, they cannot really open the chat function. So there is no interaction actually. But they still upload many things. Second strategy is hiring bloggers or influencers. So it's a kind of public-private partnerships. So that they can do the communication, very sensitive issue done through those influencers. Okay, about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all the panelists for what has been a very rich discussion. So thank you so much to all of you.
Thank you very much.